this title, The Mind Behind the Mind, is somewhat enigmatic, not necessarily easy to understand. I hope it will be easier to understand towards the end of this talk. Spontaneous thought is easier, but whatever lies beyond, we will have to see as we go along. This talk will be divided in three. There will be one part at the beginning about literature, then a part about meditation and meditative traditions, and then a part towards the end about mind wandering, and also the connection between mind wandering and the meditative project. So first, before we come to meditation, let's start in literature. The Nobel Prize laureate Kazuo Ishiguro recently wrote or published a novel called Clara and the Sun. We will look at an excerpt from a dialogue in that novel between a human being and a so-called AF, probably stands for artificial friend. It's a girl-like machine with a highly developed ability to think, to feel, and to behave like a human being. It would be interesting to see if anybody in the audience have read the book. If you have, then raise a hand now. No, you haven't had a long time to do so because it came out, I think, only in January this year. So not many people have read it yet. So I'm free to say whatever I want to say about it. In the novel, there is a dialogue between a man and a machine. The machine is this girl-like AF, and the man asks her or it, do you believe in the human heart? Something that makes each of us special and individual? And by the way, this photo I have taken from a context where it was reported that the first 3D printed heart made from human tissue has now been made, just so that we get into this science fiction mood. The machine answers, the heart you speak of might indeed be the hardest part to learn for a machine like her or it. It might be like a house with many rooms. Even so, a devoted AF, a devoted machine, given time, could walk through each of those rooms, studying them carefully in turn until they became like her own home. The man is not convinced, he says, but then suppose you stepped into one of those rooms and discovered another room within it, and inside that room, another room still. Rooms within rooms within rooms. No matter how long you wandered through those rooms, wouldn't there always be others that you had not yet entered? At this point, the machine is not yet convinced because it thinks there must be a finite number of rooms. However, even the machine changes its mind, seems to be, towards the end of the book. The man in this dialogue seems to enjoy the common view that our human essence, the essence of being human, is the part of us that makes each of us special and individual, the part that makes us different from each other. In some ways, we may say that this corresponds to our Acem experience. In every meditation or every personal dialogue and guidance after long meditations, or on every communication course, the closer you get to the genuine core of a person, the more each of us has his or her own story, which is never exactly the same as anybody else's story. At the same time, however, the deeper you go into this genuine core, the easier it becomes for others to empathize with you. As if there is a kind of common resonance chamber that is set in motion by all those individual strings. So the more uniquely personal and individual you become, the closer you get to some universal core that we all have in common. So far, everything is pure psychology, meaning things that can be perceived by our senses, by our thoughts, and by our emotions. Is there anything more in this novel? Is there any kind of force beyond these purely psychological impulses? If so, it must be the sun. In concrete terms, the machine, the AF, lives and depends on the sun for solar energy. However, in addition to this concrete function, it treats also the sun as a kind of personified God who nourishes the world with its sun rays. And there is a scene in the novel where the machine thinks it sees how the rays of the sun brings a half-dead human beggar, the so-called beggar man, back to life. And when one of the central characters of the novel, the teenage girl Josie, is so ill that her life is threatened, the machine prays for the sun to save her with its rays. And I won't reveal, of course, the end of the book, but we can look at a few excerpts from one such scene, which takes place on a dark sky morning when at some point the sun comes out. The sun's coming out, the machine says, and goes on, we must let the sun do his best, as if the sun is a male human being doing his best. And then after some time, the sun's special nourishment proved as effective for Josie as it had for Beggar Man. And after the dark sky morning, Josie grew not only stronger, but from a child into an adult. Okay, so that was Ishiguro. Now to a different century and a different genre, the famous Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen's early play, Peer Gynt. Peer Gynt, the character, is a narcissist. As such, he is quite charming, but also at times quite brutal in his self-possessedness. Throughout the play, he boasts that he is and lives as himself. But towards the end of the play, he begins to have his doubts. And for those of you in the audience, you have had more time to read this one, which was published in 1867. So again, who among you have read this play or seen a performance of it? Raise a hand now. Yeah, many more hands now. Lots of hands, actually. Good. There is a scene in the play where towards the end of the play, you can lower your hands now if you like. Towards the end of the play, there is a scene in which Peer Gynt picks up an onion and says, and compares himself to an onion and said, "An onion, that's you. Now I shall skin you, my dear little Peer." And wanting sort of to see what is at the core of himself. Is there a kernel? Is there a core? And he's beginning to despair because he sees that the number of skins that are hidden away, time that the heart saw the light of day, the heart of the core, but it doesn't. I'm damned if it does. To the very interior, the same old skins, only thin and inferior. That's what he says. So is there a kernel? Is there a core? I don't think Ibsen is arguing against there existing a core or an essence in human beings in general. I think he rather seems to be saying that Peer Gynt's narcissistic personality has been so concerned with immediate and superficial gratification of the self that his deeper layers have never been allowed to emerge and shape his life. In that sense, he has never truly been himself. And towards the end of his life, all the things he has failed to do come back and haunt him and accuse him, telling him in no uncertain terms of his many failures. We are thoughts, you should have thought us. We're songs that chime, you should have sung us. We are actions, you should have endeavored us. Doubts, distractions have crippled and severed us. Of course, in Peer Gynt's case, this happens because he is approaching death. He's at the end of his life. But again, we can see some similarities with meditation processes, especially with non-directive meditation, in which spontaneous thoughts, feelings, impulses, images, sensations, etc., are allowed to play themselves out freely, so that thoughts and maybe tears and feelings and maybe personal goals come spontaneously to mind that would otherwise have been kept under a lid until they were broken. And when asking a certain character what it is to be oneself, Peer Gynt gets this mysterious answer. To be oneself is oneself to slay. And the character continues. But on you, that's a waste of an explanation. So let's put it like this, above all, to obey the master's intention without hesitation. We'll come back to how various meditative traditions look upon the self in a moment. Henrik Ibsen was not known as a religious person, but still many of his plays discuss a calling from above, wherever that is, that goes beyond narrow self-interest. Something that goes beyond one's own immediate needs, whether psychological or biological, and gives a kind of overall direction to life. Peer Gynt himself objects that, how could I know what the master has intended for me? And in this English translation, the answer is clear. You could have known it by intuition, or in Norwegian, even more sort of suitable, anelse, not by firm knowledge. Intuition is it. And we'll come back to the role of intuition a little later in this talk also. So if we sum up so far, what we've seen in these two literary works, both of them are concerned with the complexities of our psychology in the usual sense of the word, as something that concerns our thoughts and feelings and senses and other impulses. But both are also concerned with something beyond pure psychology in this narrow sense, with existential issues. In Ishiguro's novel, in the image of the sun, in Ibsen, as a calling from above. I don't think any of these should be read too literally, only as symbols pointing in the direction of something beyond our basic psychology, the mind behind the mind, if you like. Before we go on, let's have a brief look at what the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor calls the sources of the self in the history of the Western tradition. Of course, such histories of a development in a long tradition like this one can only be very schematic and simplified. Reality is always much more complex. But in this view, the pre-modern self is to a very large extent dependent on external authority to judge what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. There are traditions, there are institutions that are supposed to tell you. And this kind of pre-modern or traditional society is also, to a very large extent, communal, meaning that you're always part of a family, part of a society, part of something larger than yourself. And it's, to a very large extent, also oriented towards religion. And of course, it's not as if external authority in the form of traditions and institutions is not found in modern societies, only that the focus is slightly different. The modern self has gone through a kind of inward turn, reflecting on its own self and focusing to a large extent on experience. So the authority to judge right from wrong, good from bad, lies in the individual and the individual's experience. And to a large extent, you can say that Acem belongs here. We have an experience-based approach to meditation and the human psyche, with different layers of conscious, subconscious, and unconscious impulses. We are oriented to a large extent towards individuals, and we teach a form of meditation that is independent of any specific religious worldview. There is in the modern self already a tendency to question all authorities. And when we come to the postmodern self, this is brought out as a kind of attempt to deconstruct all authority. And the result is, in the postmodern period, a self often without a core, fragmentary self, a rootless person who lacks often an anchoring point. Again, we should emphasize that, of course, this is not as if we go from pre-modern to modern and postmodern, now we're only postmodern, only like this. We are, of course, part of all of these things. So don't take this too literally, but there are tendencies here that are important and that I think to some extent influence all of us. Okay, let's go now to the second part of the talk about meditation, meditative minds. If we talk about this as the contemplative self, the meditative self, you can say that all kinds of meditative traditions, contemplative traditions, stand in a way in the psychological self, inhabiting a world of senses, thoughts, and feelings, but then orient themselves or itself towards an existential self, inhabiting a world that goes, to some extent at least, beyond senses, thoughts, and feelings. You can say also that the fragmented nature of the postmodern self comes from the prison of our senses, thoughts, and feelings. They are all fleeting, transient, impermanent, and may take us in so many different directions that it can be bewildering. So the question is, can contemplative or meditative traditions tell us anything about a world beyond these fleeting impulses? Maybe with some similarities to Ishiguro's Nourishing Sun or to Ibsen's Calling from Above. And how, if at all, does the Acem meditation process touch upon this dimension? In contrast to the narrow individuality of the modern self and the fragmentation of the postmodern self, meditative traditions tend to attempt to break out of and go beyond our narcissism, our individuality, as if responding to what Peer Gynt was told, to be oneself is oneself to slay. You see that in Christianity, in yoga, in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Zen as a kind of Buddhism, and in Taoism, in different ways. A common trait in contemplative traditions across the Eurasian continent, breaking down, emptying, or expanding the individual self in order for the person to open up to another dimension. Perhaps just quote from the Zen quote here: to follow Buddha's way is to follow the self. To follow the self is to forget the self, almost as if he were telling Peer Gynt about the self. Now, how can we experience anything that goes beyond our senses, thoughts, and feelings? And the answer for us too, I think, in this context is intuition. Intuition is a word with many different meanings, so we'll have to make clear what we do mean with it. In contemporary philosophy, intuition is often understood as a kind of knowledge that you don't know where it comes from, you just know it. In our context, in this context, I think intuition is not really knowledge. It's just a hunch or an inkling or a vague idea about something, which may develop into a deeper insight, but never into firm or factual knowledge. As Peer Gynt is told, without this kind of intuition, the chap with the hoof, the devil, will take hold of you. Now, in most contemplative or meditative traditions, there is a kind of duality involved between what we just talked about as the psychological world of senses, thoughts, and feelings, and what we may call the existential world beyond senses, thoughts, and feelings. Many meditative traditions are basically only concerned with this world beyond. And I think Acem's most important contribution perhaps lies in the development of a user-oriented and very this-worldly psychology of meditation, taking the many layers of everyday senses, thoughts, and feelings seriously. Now, this contemplative duality differs from Descartes' dualism of body and mind, or matter and spirit, in a very clear way. In this contemplative duality, both body and mind belongs to the world of senses, thoughts, and feelings, whereas the existential world beyond is also beyond body and mind. So it's a very different duality from Descartes' dualism. And you can also see in various traditions that they treat this kind of duality in different ways. In Christianity and in yoga, there is a very clear distinction between sort of the this worldly part and the otherworldly part, between creation and the creator in Christianity, etc. In some schools of Hinduism, such as Vedanta, and in Buddhism, there is often talk of a non-dualism. One rejects the dualism and say that actually what seems to us to be dual is in fact the same thing. But because of that, they are also very much concerned with these dual oppositions and concerned with saying that they are in fact one. And then you have what is often called the monism of at least Taoist thought in China, or many other also contemplative traditions, which, well, makes a distinction between Tao, the way, and everything else, but which doesn't really say that these are two that are actually one. It just sort of everything is a part of everything else. But still in a kind of dualistic way, in the sense that within the heart, it says, there is another heart, almost as if they are quoting from the title of this talk, The Mind Behind the Mind, or with the mind within the mind. Okay, let's now go to the last part of this talk, about mind wandering, the wandering minds. The wandering mind is something that many traditions, many contemplative or meditative traditions, are quite skeptical about. So whether they call it spontaneous thought, mind wandering, or whatever else they call it, because it belongs to the world of senses, thoughts, and feelings, and therefore, in a way, distracts us from our ultimate goal, the way it is seen in these traditions. Now, this we may, of course, ask then: because the wandering mind keeps the mind, belongs to the world of senses, thoughts, and feelings, does it really keep the mind from entering the world beyond? At least this aspect of many traditions contrasts with Acem's approach and other forms of non-directive meditation, in which mind wandering is an important part of the meditative process. We see in many traditions, again, that mind wandering is part of our psychological self, not the existential self beyond senses, thoughts, and feelings. In Christianity, the wandering mind is part of creation, not of the creator, God. In yoga, you see also that there is a wish to calm the wandering mind. And in Taoism, you have texts saying that the wandering mind, or something similar to that, leaves no place for the way, for the Tao, which one is seeking. But on the other hand, everything is part of the world of senses, thoughts, and feelings. Whether it's mental things or external things or our bodies or whatever, all these things are, of course, part of the world of senses, thoughts, and feelings. So why do these traditions single out the wandering mind for special criticism or skepticism, if you like? And I think one of the reasons why the wandering mind is singled out this way is precisely that it has to do with the mind. And the mind is our most important channel and perhaps tool, not only for understanding our psychological self, but also for approaching the existential dimension. External things are, of course, also important. And our bodies are located somewhere in between external things and our internal mind. But ultimately, in order to approach the existential dimension, we need to go through the mind. So there are different degrees here of subtlety or subtleness, from things to body to mind. And in the meditation process, the wandering mind may gradually go through a process from relative coarseness to relative subtlety or subtleness. And the more subtle the movements of the mind are, the closer we move towards the existential dimension, the area beyond our physical senses, beyond plain thought, and beyond the intensity of our feelings and emotions. Some meditative traditions try to achieve this by attempting to stop the mind from wandering. while it is precisely the free coming and going of spontaneous thoughts and feelings and images in Acem meditation and other forms of non-directed meditation that brings us closer to this kind of subtleness or subtlety. And this kind of subtleness or subtlety has two important effects. And we're now talking about spontaneous effects, not things that we strive towards. The one is the calming of the wandering mind, which is a very common experience in meditation, whether it's Acem meditation or perhaps also other forms of meditation, and that you see in many meditative traditions, but which is not something that you should strive for, at least not in non-directive meditation. It just happens as you go along. And then on the other hand, spontaneously also, deeper structures tend to emerge in the process, both helpful structures that bring us closer to an intuitive opening of the mind, and obstacles and limitations that are ingrained in our psychology, in our personality, and that need to be processed or melted down for us to proceed. These are some examples of traditions that point to the same kind of gradual increase in subtleness. There is, in the early Christian tradition, the Desert Fathers. One of them was Evagrius, who lived in and worked in the Egyptian desert, and who says at different places that spontaneous thoughts come from demons. The ones that come from demons are the coarsest ones. They may come from humans, which make them more or less neutral. They may come from angels, which is, of course, on the more subtle side, or they may come from God as a kind of divine inspiration. In Buddhism, we have Ji, the meditation master, 6th century, who thinks that the calming of the mind spontaneously reveals to us some of the karmic roots, the roots that have to do with karma from early lives. In this context, we talk about reincarnation. And where there are good karmic roots that provide a link to the meditator, to earlier meditative states from earlier lives that you can sort of link up to. And there are bad karmic roots, things that you've done that went against the whole process that need to be counted by meditation. So in different ways, different traditions have approached some of the same process of gradual increase in subtleness of the spontaneous mind. This, of course, is not a linear process. It is not a one-way street. There are always forces working also in the opposite direction within us. The whole process activates a kind of inner resistance where from, at least for a moment, or for example, for a period, we go from subtle mind into coarser aspects of the mind that don't want to bring us down to this kind of subtlety. So moving closer to the existential dimension implies also at times temporarily moving further away and having this kind of resistance against the move forward. There are some traditions again, Evagrius and G, who seem to have had similar experiences, though they interpret those experiences as if the counterforces, the resistance, comes from outside, from the demons. Evagrius says that demons become envious when we pray. And G, the meditation master, says that as practice, meditative practice, progresses, Mara, the sort of the ultimate demon in Buddhist demonology, flourishes. So however they talk about it, this is in a way the dark night of the soul, a place where you would rather at some point get away from, but which you need to go through in order also to bring yourself forward in the meditative process. Well, Acem's approach is, in Acem's approach, this is more a part of our psychology. There is something inside us that prefers to keep the status quo because it feels safer. And in order to work your way through these forces, you need to accept and acknowledge their existence. Contemplative and meditative traditions, as we have seen, have many things in common. All over, at least the Eurasian continent, Europe and Asia, but probably also in other parts of the world. But one important point on which they differ from each other is the degree of effort involved, or on the contrary, the degree of acceptance towards the wandering mind. Non-directive meditation, such as Acem meditation, has effortlessness and the acceptance of the spontaneous activity of the mind as a kind of basic premise, while directive forms of meditation often use concentration and attempt to avoid or get rid of mind wandering. And there are also many traditions that are quite ambivalent between these two approaches. You can see in the yoga tradition that what some people call the yoga of suppression, where you suppress the wandering mind, is by others understood as a spontaneous result of doing yoga, of something that calms down spontaneously. In the Buddhist context, you can hear Han Shan, the Chinese Buddhist master Han Shan, who says, on the one hand, don't cling to the meditation object. Don't be so concerned and effortful and concentrated with your meditation. But on the other hand, when there are too many thoughts, he also says, bring forth the meditation object as if you were pushing a heavy cart uphill of all your effort. Another Buddhist master, also Chinese, says, sort of tries to solve this problem by saying that a meditation that accepts the coming and going of thoughts is more advanced than methods to rid the mind of thoughts. So there is a kind of hierarchy of different methods in this case. In the case of Evagrius and G, you also see the same kind of ambivalence. Evagrius, pray with fear, trembling effort, and with inner watchfulness and vigilance. Quite strong in his wording. But on the other hand, if you patiently accept what comes, you will always pray with joy. And G, the Buddhist meditation master, says that calming the mind can happen in 3 different ways. It can happen by tying the mind to an object, which is sort of a concentrative way of doing things, by suppressing the mind as much as you can, which is also quite concentrative in our context, or it can be a spontaneous result of penetrating the ultimate truth, reaching some kind of insight that calms the mind spontaneously. So in our meditations, we stand, or rather sit, in the concrete world of our senses, thoughts, and feelings, while our minds wander through sensations and images, the coming and going of thoughts, as well as moods and emotions. And non-directive meditation, such as Acem meditation, facilitates this spontaneous stream of impulses. And this helps to smooth out some of the friction contained in the wandering mind and gradually makes it more subtle. And this is a way to reduce stress, to untie some of the knots of your personality, and, as we have been talking about here, to approach the existential dimension with intuition and gradually some degree of insight. So I wish you all a happy journey. Thank you.